Why do people keep saying to unmask? It's a privilege to unmask. That is very true. It is a privilege to unmask. It's also a privilege to be able to mask. Because if you're more apparent as a neurodivergent, you're going to get clocked as different. And the type of societal stigma you face immediately is very different. Yeah, so it's both a privilege and a curse, kind of. Hello and welcome to the Trauma-Informed SLP. I am Kim Neely. SLP stands for Speech Language Pathologist, of which I'm a licensed one here in the United States. And on this channel, I like to use my clinical training, my clinical experience, my personal experience as a late diagnosed neurodivergent and queer person, and my academic knowledge of a couple of years of a neuroscience PhD, and my special interest on trauma-informed care to unpack things. So that's what we're doing here. And on today, I'm going to do my very first, kind of looking at some interesting things that I screenshotted off of Reddit and just talking about them as topics and stuff and just sort of spilling my viewpoint here on the interwebs. So hopefully you like it. If you do, be sure to click the thumbs up down there because that really helps because I'm a little too weird for algorithms. So it'd be lovely to let the algorithm know. I really rely on you guys to let the algorithm know, hey, yeah, this is good content. Send it out to more people. That's essentially what the like is. And also the subscribe button. I would really love to get to 1,000 subscribers because then I could start just running ads essentially and get a little bit of a little teeny, $10 a year kind of thing. And hey, that's better than zero. So I'm good with that. All right. Let's go ahead and get to it though. So today's video, the topics that I selected for today are going to overlap a lot with some of my videos that are in my For Late Diagnosed Neurodivergent playlist, which you can click over and take a look at if you would like to, or you could finish watching this and then look, that's fine too. But things that essentially have to do a little bit with, I'm kind of picked a theme here, and the theme for today are things that have to do with unmasking and just kind of what we deal with as late diagnosed neurodivergents when we're socialized a certain way and with certain expectations and some of the dangers that leads for us, Let's go ahead and get into the whole Reddit thing. Let's go. This is on the R Autism in Women subreddit, Autism in Women. And personally, I find the ADHD in women in Autism in Women subreddits to be kind of the less toxic of the ADHD/autism subreddits out there. I do see a lot more encouraging comments and stuff there. This person, it says 8 hours ago, but I know I screenshotted this weeks ago, so this is a very old thing now. But it's a very good question, and it's one I see come up, and honestly one I've thought about a lot just for my own life. So potential teacher 77 asked, what traits of autism attract predators? And it has a flair of potentially triggering content discussion welcome. So just so you know, potentially triggering content. If you don't want to talk about this, skip ahead to my next little Reddit thing. You might be okay with that one. Hey. They go on to say, after getting out of a toxic relationship, I am dying to know how exactly do predators spot us? I keep seeing people say we are like a magnet for narcissists, manipulators, and other predatory types. I've dated a lot throughout my life. 50% were normal men the relationship didn't work for compatibility reasons. The other 50% straight up toxic, exhibiting personality disorder traits, cheating, constant lying, and everything bad. I am conventionally attractive, so I'd say 70% of my relationships I initiated first contact, whether in person, at a social event, with friends, or via a dating app. I definitely have been rejected, but I'm mentioning this because it has been completely random / by chance I met the abusive ones. I'm at a point where I'm starting to think this is less of a neurodivergent woman issue and more of a men are socialized to be emotionally violent. Yeah, I think that might be part of it. But I'm interested to know what I could do to protect myself. It seems to be a mask that's worth wearing. I'm so over toxic men, they are literally all the same. And I mean, I guess we always have to start with the caveat here on the internet that it's not just men. Women can be toxic too. Non-binary people can be toxic. any human can be toxic because we're all humans and we all have that sort of variance in us. And we all have all kinds of stuff we're carrying with us all the time. But yes, I have heard this discussed before. I have wondered about this a lot. And I have a lot of different thoughts that swirl around in my head about this. I have a lot of like, sometimes when I can come at the issue in different ways, I have like these pillars that pop up in my head, almost like you could go through this door 1 or door 2 or door 3 and explore this from all those different angles. So let's see how far I get and if I forget one of the doors. But I think the very first thing that tends to pop into my head, and that I saw a lot on the comments on this, is that, you know, from a really young age, we're essentially taught. So for those of us neurodivergents who are non-apparent, that's what I like to say. I don't use level 1, level 2 when I'm talking about group level stuff. We're talking about societal adversity stuff when we're talking this level. So non-apparent, I'm borrowing it from the disability community. It means that your difference is not immediately clocked by people, right? So it's just not apparent that you're different, that your brain is wired differently, right? So most late diagnosed neurodivergents tend to fall in non-apparent category. Caveat would be those, particularly BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, because they tend to be underdiagnosed, and also just like people assigned female at birth. So I think that that's part of it, though, is that we're primed essentially, right? We're primed for not trusting or believing our own social instincts. So this comes out because even from really young, I mean, I have memories of being like 3 or 4 years old, remembering being like rejected by peers at birthday parties and stuff, right? And going off in a corner somewhere to kind of cry by myself because like, and nobody really cared, you know, you know what I mean? Because I probably came off as weird, you know? They wanted to play with me at first, and then I came off a little too weird, or I came on too strong, or whatever I did, or I didn't want to play by their rules, or I broke the rules or something, and they sort of pushed me aside, right? And I see it happen at the preschool level too, that when I worked with preschoolers, it still happens. It still happens with preschoolers, unless they're taught to like, you have to, as an adult, you kind of have to guide them to be accepting of differences and for there not to be a problem with the differences. And then usually the kids can adjust, but they learn early on, you know? So that's the type of stuff we tend to develop. We develop this like this disbelief in our own instincts of like who people are and what they actually intend, right? Because we can't always read social cues correctly anyway. So we're relying on other people to tell us, what did that person mean by that comment? Or is that person actually my friend or not? Or I thought they were my friends. What happened there? Why aren't we friends anymore? We're looking for other people's input constantly about who we are, why we do what we do, and where we mess up with other people as we grow up, right? And that is definitely going to prime us for personality types that tend to be more entitled or selfish or willing to manipulate in order to get what they want, right? So because those personality types, now I'm an armchair, expert, got my YouTube degree pretty much, my Dr. Ramani degree, basically, watching a lot of her videos on like narcissism and stuff. My understanding is of like people with more narcissistic personality traits, not talking about personality disorder full on necessarily, but is that like the entitlement is really deep in there, and the like lack of empathy in the sense of like they don't really mind that they're manipulating to get what they want because they feel entitled to what they want. So as long as they can get it, they're fine with that, right? And that's why like you end up with like the love bombing thing, the gaslighting stuff, right? But like the love bombing for initially of like, oh my God, you're so amazing, you're so great, you're so this, you're so that. And like, I don't know about you guys, but I feel like at this age, I feel like I don't just get love bombed in personal relationships. I get love bombed also like in jobs. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of everywhere in society, I think, for a lot of neurodivergents. Because initially you get hired and it's like, oh my God, we're so glad you're here and you're doing so great. And oh, you picked up so fast and this is so wonderful. And then like, I just have to wait for the shoe to drop and for someone to like get angry at me and I to be completely unaware of that fact that they're angry because they're being passive aggressive and I don't notice it. And then there's this whole like domino effect that might happen from me falling out of favor, basically, right? And like me being like, the whole the process of falling out of favor going straight over my head. And all I notice are the really concrete results of it at the end of it, you know? And so I feel that way if I start working at a new organization, especially larger companies and stuff. I start feeling like, oh man, they're going to kind of, I always have to get over that like hump of like, they keep telling me I'm awesome, but I guess we'll see. We'll see if their opinion sticks. I don't know, right? And I kind of look at that way with like friends and like other relationships now. I think of it as like we'll see if you still like me in a few months. You seem to enjoy me right now, but we'll see where you're at after you get to know me a little bit more, because that's when the shoe drops, right? That's when that like classic, like, especially for these types of personalities that are more love bomby and stuff, like that's when they'll discard you. They'll be tired, right? They'll be like, oh, I start to see what's wrong with you, you know? So I really think that it's not so much that we attract them. I do think another one of the doors, like pillars that came up in my mind is, as like Dr. Ramani and other people out there talking about this says, like, there is a certain reward for certain toxic behaviors in our society right now that make them very prevalent, particularly in men when it comes to like the manosphere and feeling entitled to a woman's attention, and feeling, you know, in heteronormative relationships, feeling entitled to, you know, like all you got to do is make a paycheck and women should be fawning over you and like willing to, you know, marry you, no problem, or jump into bed with you or whatever, you know, and that women should be the ones doing all this work to attract the man. And then you have this whole like male loneliness epidemic thing where they're still putting it on the women to like fix it. And it's like women are like, we're tired of fixing. And then men like kind of whine more about the fact that women aren't fixing. And it just becomes this whole thing. It's this just constant back and forth thing. You know, there's definitely that sort of issue happening as well. And in the US, especially, we have big attacks on women's rights as well happening. Like there's some genuinely very serious and incredibly concerning consequences for this type of attitude and this type of stuff being promoted on social media and like villainizing feminism and things like that, right? Like there's some real social costs to this that's very, very serious. But I think that also might lead to, instead of, you know, maybe we're not attracting them as much as it's just that like we're more inclined to give them a benefit of the doubt because we're more inclined to ignore our initial instinct with this person. If we're like, wow, they're coming on kind of strong, I'm not so sure I like this person, we might ignore that. Other people might not, right? We might be like, oh, they're actually just being nice, because certain cues go over our head and we're just trained not to pay attention to those sort of like red flags that often. And the other thing I think is the fact that like it does seem to me anyway, I mean, maybe it's just that recency bias of seeing it on social media all the time, but it seems like there are people out there who are really embracing this, like, I can do whatever I want kind of mentality, and I'm entitled to have things go my way kind of mentality. And it's like, that's going to be toxic whenever you're in a relationship with another person. You can't sustain like a good relationship if it's this constant transactional, I should get what I want at the sacrifice of all of your needs, you know? Like that's not going to ever be healthy as a dynamic, right? So I do think there's a little bit of that in here too, which makes it feel like you're probably like encountering them more often. And also being conventionally attractive, you're probably going to get people who feel entitled to have an attractive partner, right? So pretty privilege is a thing in the sense of like the people who will agree to go out with you if you're initiating contact, if they feel like finally an attractive woman out there is finally approaching me, finally someone sees that I'm a high value man or whatever, like, you know, that can be a very toxic guy, right? But and if you weren't conventionally attractive, that guy would probably brush you off and not care, right? And be like, ew, why would I want to go out with someone who looks like that, you know, right? You wouldn't be the prize, the reward, the award that they want for being a guy, I guess. So I do think that's part of it. I think that in terms of protecting ourselves, I actually was just watching a really good video the other day where they were highlighting the going slow with relationships of all kinds. And like I was saying for myself, like when I get a new job now, I don't expect everyone at that job to like me after the first, I give it like a good 3 months, solid 3 months to know, is this going to be like some sort of toxic, passive aggressive, now suddenly people really don't like me when they liked me before? Or are these people actually kind of cool and chill and I can, and I'm good working here with them, and like with friendships and stuff, it's like benefit of the doubt, but also boundaries within the first 3 months or so, right? Like, okay, I can hang out, but like not all the time, right? And, if I find myself being overly complimentary, I also back off. Like, I don't want people to think I'm a love bomber, right? But sometimes I've gotten used to like letting my positive thoughts out of my mouth more often because I'm more disinhibited anyway. And so it's a nice way to get those thoughts out and like not have to inhibit what I'm thinking when I think of something complimentary towards somebody. So, if I'm like, oh, you're so funny or you're so great or whatever, like I'll drop those compliments toward like new friends. But I also I'm not going to text them and constantly want to hang out or anything either, right? Like I'm going to balance that with like, I'm not making any demands on them. This isn't a love bomb for the intention of having them like get sucked into my life and like make me feel great, like that's not the purpose. So I really feel like, at least for me, I feel like instead of it being a mask, because I don't really like the idea of like having to mask up a ton, a mask in the sense of boundaries with like new friends and new relationships, new closer relationships, and even jobs and stuff, right? Having some level of emotional boundary there, enjoying the positive feeling of feeling like I belong somewhere, but also tempering that with, we'll see what happens in a few months though. Give this a little bit more time, right? To sort of suss this out. Because if I find this video, I'll link it down below. But as they were saying on that video, it was like these more toxic, manipulative, entitled type of personalities, they get tired. Like if you're not going to be a big boost of emotional supply to them when they're in that love bombing stage, they're going to get sick of being around you. They're going to kind of disappear on you pretty quickly, right? So if you give it a good solid 3 months or so, and you put those boundaries down of like, okay, we can hang out, but maybe like once a week, right? Like we're not going to hang out every day. This isn't going to be an all the time thing right now. Like we're going to ease into hanging out. Maybe once a week we do some regular hanging out or whatever. Like that's fine. Or we hang out in groups, in a group setting more often, and then maybe individually once a week or something. But like, you just don't get sucked into like the all the time every day. You're not going to start rearranging your life for that person immediately, right? And so, and then like those personalities will kind of give up because they don't want to deal with that. So less of a mask, more of a boundary thing, I think. And it is really hard, I will say, as a somewhat impulsive person who gets really excited and like really wanting to hang out with people all the time when I find cool new people, I have to regulate myself. I have to calm myself down and remind myself, like, I have to be like, Kim, you're 47 years old. You're not 5 years old on a playground. You're not besties immediately. Chill out. You know what I mean? It's like, yes, they're awesome. It's really cool. Do not come on too strong. You need to back off, right? Like I have kind of this like kind of feeling about it, right? Where I have to kind of control my own desire to like contact that person or contact the new people and hang out all the time. It's like, no, you have to take a step back, relax, maybe go do a hobby or something, maybe go chill or go exercise or take a walk or something, right? When it's not like 100 degrees outside. So that like I don't get sucked into wanting to be around that person. And I can also kind of start to judge a little better of like, do I actually feel good around this person because of who they are and how I feel about myself when I'm around them? That's another question I've been asking myself a lot, which I kind of stole off of somebody who told their like counselor told them to check in with that, is how do you feel around this person? If you feel like nervous, fluttery butterflies, that might not be a good thing. Do you feel safe and comfortable and peaceful? Or do you feel on edge, like they might judge you harshly at any moment? Or do you feel euphoric, like you must be the greatest thing since sliced bread and that your poop is never going to stink with this person? Because that's also probably a red flag, because that's not reality of human life ever. None of us are perfect, right? So I don't know if that helps or not. Drop a comment if you have some other things. I feel like there was a third pillar door that I thought about and I can't remember what it is now. So should have written that down. Anyway. So let's move on to the second Reddit thing now, because this kind of ties in a little bit. A little bit, I think. It's sort of like the precursor to figuring out how not to be sucked into like the toxic personality types. You know what I mean? And this is from Our Autism, good old classic Our Autism, the autism subreddit. Boom. And apparently it was 14 days ago that this was posted. So it's been a little while, but this one is, oh no, I don't know how to say the Reddit username. Thopsiagorm? I don't know. Anyway, they asked, why do people keep saying to unmask? Every social media post, video, and comic about autism usually has some flowery language at the end about having the courage to unmask. But what does that even accomplish? It's a privilege to unmask. That is very true. It is a privilege to unmask. It's also a privilege to be able to mask. Because if you're more apparent as a neurodivergent, you're going to get clocked as different. And the type of societal stigma you face immediately is very different. Yeah. So it's kind of it's both a privilege and a curse, kind of. If I were to really unmask in public, I would be abused and punished worse. I can see all the horror stories about being punished for autistic behavior right here on this sub. So why do social media / therapy circles advocate for unmasking in the first place? How is it healthier to be further abused by society? And there are a lot of really good comments here. This is by CPT PJs. Like CPTSD, like complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPT PJs. I love it. I feel like that should be like a cure for CPTSD. It's like, here's some PJs. They're the most comfortable little things. It's like the mother's hug for your inner child. Masking all the time is exhausting. Finding a balance of being yourself and being safe is a tricky one, but just having some time alone where you can switch off and not do all the stuff you didn't even realize you were doing can be life-changing. And that is essentially how I feel about it, because here's the deal. Masking is both exhausting and also it just reinforces the internalized shame, which I do have another video on if you want to click on over and check those guys out. If you're masking all the time, except for maybe when you're alone, it's hard to distinguish where you end and your fawning response begins, because I essentially think of masking as a fawn response. Okay. It's a people-pleasing thing. It's something we learn to do to try to accomplish some level of societal safety, of like psychological and emotional safety around other people, and sometimes physical safety if you're around like physically abusive people or bullies or something, right? But essentially humans are communal. Most of us require being around other humans to feel really, truly safe, okay, and taken care of and accepted by the community. That's a really important thing for our brain. Our brain sees if you're unsafe in your own community, that is seen as the same as like physically being unsafe, like being hunted by like a predator. Okay. Like your brain, as far as your survival modes are concerned, it's kind of the same deal. So it's very stressful. So you have that issue of the fawn response being kind of this, it comes out of that trauma of being rejected, right? And you develop this way of trying to prevent that from happening. So you develop a fawn response, and we call that masking. And you start doing it from so young, especially as a non-apparent neurodivergent. A lot of us start doing it from so young that as we get older and try to figure out who the heck we even are as teenagers or adults, like we don't even know where to start, right? And you'll see it still online where people are like, I was like diagnosed and I have no idea who I am. And I'm like 65 and I never knew who I was. And I don't even know how to start unmasking because I've been doing it for so long, right? You see that a lot. And this kind of goes along with the like attracting the more toxic personalities in a way, because the more we learn to people please, the more we learn to fawn, the less we learn to trust our own instincts and ourselves, and the less we understand what our needs are as people, as individuals. We don't know what our boundaries are, and we don't know what our social needs are. We don't know where the limit is on our energy that we're putting into masking. We don't know how burnt out we're getting from the masking. We can't even check in with ourselves that way. And, I don't know whether we develop the alexithymia from something like that, because alexithymia is that, I have another video on that as well, but it's the inability to label your emotions or the emotions of others. So you might feel the emotion in your body, but you're not consciously aware of your emotion happening. And that is very prevalent in autism communities and ADHD communities and also trauma communities. So whether it's innate to how our brains are wired or it's from this, for non-apparent neurodivergence, it might just be from sort of the trauma response of being socially rejected constantly, right? And we're kind of in that chronic state of stress around other people because we're waiting to be treated poorly, basically. We're waiting for the shoe to drop and we're desperately trying to keep it from happening, right? We're desperately trying to keep ourselves from being teased or bullied or actually like physically beat up or whatever, right? So it is exhausting to mask. They are right about that. And it is that like you can kind of get lost in the, like that's going to create this chronic stress of being in this chronic kind of saturated trauma response of I can't ever unmask around anyone so that I can be safe, right? Well, then you're going to feel disconnected from other people. You're going to feel disconnected from yourself, like I said, especially if you develop some sort of alexithymia related to that. And we actually know from something called the minority stress model, this is, and I know it's not the most ideal term, but it was a research model developed in kind of the early 2000s. I want to say 2003 around about was the first paper I think on it. It was essentially the first model that really, I mean, it's sad to say that it took that long for this to happen, I guess, but it was the first model in like psychology to really take into account the impact of being in a marginalized group in society on an individual's mental health, especially as an adult. So it started out with transgender people, I think, was the first population studied, and now it's been broadened to be studied on, different races and ethnicities and other marginalized groups, and also autistics is another one of the groups that has been studied in this. And essentially, this model shows, basically prior to this model coming out, everybody was like, there was a lot of research on transgender people having mental health issues, and it was like, somehow, maybe there's a genetic tie between being transgender and just being more prone to depression or anxiety is sort of was the running idea. And then this this researcher, Meyer, I believe was the last name of the researcher, I believe. I think I got that right. I'm not good with remembering names though, so I might have that wrong. Anyway, so they came up, and I think he maybe came up with this model that basically says you have to consider societal adversity, and that most transgender people, especially before they transition, they constantly feel wrong all the time, right? They feel like they're in the wrong body. They feel wrong. They feel something's really wrong with them. There's a lot of internalized shame that comes from that. And that secrecy and that lack of being able to connect with other people about their transgenderism just makes that shame and that isolation grow. And then, like, if you take that out of the psychological models, like, that is the strongest correlation with, like, depression and anxiety and other mental health issues as adults. And if you ignore that correlation, then, yeah, it's like, why? Why would this be the case? But, like, no, it's because they're experiencing this, like, internalized stigma, internalized kind of transphobia, internalized sense of I'm wrong, something's wrong with me, that sense of shame we get from that, right? And autistics also adopt that. And other non-apparent neurodivergents adopt that sort of feeling. And probably more apparent neurodivergence as well. But those of us who are able to mask, right? We are given that option because we're not clocked immediately as different. We do internalize something's wrong with us because we experience a lot of social rejection. So the idea is I come off as like a person for a while, and then suddenly I'm not who they thought I was, and they're very displeased with me, and I must have done something wrong, right? Especially as little kids, our brain interprets that as somehow I'm wrong. Oops, I screwed up, right? And then, that sense of shame that we carry leads us to mask even more. And it's just kind of this not self-fulfilling, what is it called? Self-propelling, I guess. What is it? it's just this constant cycle, basically, right? We get accepted into some social groups or something, and then we mask even more, and then we try to unmask a little bit, and we get negative feedback from that, so then we mask even more, right? And it just keeps going and going and going until you end up being like a middle-aged neurodivergent like me and many others who are so burnt out we can barely function. And we hit, like the weekend hits us like a giant concrete wall that we just want to sleep through because we're so exhausted from our whole week, right? Because like we have never let ourselves relax and we just keep burning through the energy, just like the CPT PJs was saying, which I love. Now, the comment underneath CPT PJs says, yep, even neurotypicals tend to mask in public and unmask in private or safe spaces. Even though their masking takes up less energy, it is still unsustainable in the long term, and neurodivergent masking takes up a lot more energy. Taking breaks from masking staves off burnout. Now, this comment is true. I agree with most of the comment, but I don't think all neurotypicals mask in public. Not always. Depends on who you're talking about. As a fawn response, masking would be true if the person is part of a marginalized group. If you're part of a marginalized group, there's probably some type of masking you do in public. But I do think people confuse masking with like customer service voice or like a persona type voice, which, yeah, there's some sense of, you're protective of your own employment and your job. You got to stay nice with the customers because you can't like unleash what you want to say. Can't just go flipping off the Karens all the time, kind of a thing if you're a service worker or whatever, right? So yeah, but at the same time, that persona is not, I don't think, like I did a lot of customer service jobs back in my musician days, and I never felt like it was a reflection on me as a person. That customer service persona was literally just a thing I put on for my job, and I never internalized it as like, oh, something is so wrong with me because I got really angry at that customer, or that customer got angry at me. Clearly it was my fault. Like that never really happened unless I did mess up, but then it's like, oops, sorry. I mean, you got to move on from it. Like what else are you going to do? But it's like, I never internalized a ton of shame from that. Or if I let the customer service persona drop a little because I was exhausted and it was closed and I was just tired and I just sort of gave like base level service, I never felt like ashamed of that. I never walked away being like, wow, something's really inherently awful and wrong with me because I let my exhaustion show, right? So that's why I think masking and fawning is a little different, because masking and or fawning, whichever way you want to think about it, is like, if I let this drop for 1 second, I'm in danger. That's sort of what your survival mode-y type brain thinks, right? Your kind of subconscious brain that's trying to look for threats. That's what it thinks, is if I let this drop, I'm in danger and I'm in trouble and it's going to be really, 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 really bad, right? And so I disagree with it in the sense that I don't think all neurotypicals inherently mask. I think it really depends on probably where they are, what group they're with, and if they are part of a marginalized group. I mean, if they have a tight community of people within that group, they might not really mask around them either, right? So like the Black community in America, capital B Black community, like there can be some unmasking there versus like being around, being in a room full of white people, right? So I'm not so sure that really true that like, they didn't say every neurotypical, but I don't know that they always tend to mask, right? But also when it comes to which takes up more or less energy, I think that's hard to say. But I do think for non-apparent neurodivergence, at least for me as an older one, like in, like I said, 47, for me, the issue was you still feel like you have to mask at home as a kid. You're never able to just be you, unless you're literally by yourself. When you're literally in private, maybe you could kind of like just do whatever you want. But like around any other human, I felt like I couldn't just fully be myself for a very long time in life, right? So I think that is another piece of it where maybe it doesn't necessarily take more energy while we're doing it. We just do it more consistently because we're expected to do it more consistently, because people still have it in their mind that they can fix us by constantly correcting us. When in reality, if you're constantly corrected for being who you are, it's that minority stress model of you internalize that as something is inherently horrible and wrong with me and broken. And then that leads to potentially, or correlates very highly with negative mental health impacts later down the road. So to answer your question is why unmask it all, it's for your own health and safety first. It's for your mental health, for your safety, and also for your ability to be able to tell when you're around people who you feel safe around, like who your people really are, right? I have a whole video on masking, and I think I go into a little bit of, my tips on how to start unmasking in that video if you want to check that out. Oh, yes, this is actually that other pillar from the other, it just popped into my head because it kind of relates to this topic too. The unmasking topic, and like my thought of like, you might not be able to unmask in your house, right? And this is another thing about like going back to the why we might attract more of the toxic personality types, or might not be able to tell perhaps the toxic personality types as well. I do think, especially for those of us in our 40s, 50s, what have you, a lot of us get our late diagnosis and we're the only one in the family that's diagnosed. But then we look at our family and we're like, we probably came by this neurodivergency, honestly, right? We look at our parents and think, ooh, yeah, I think they might have a thing. They might have, they might have a little, yeah, they might be diagnosable. You know what I mean? Right? And if that's the case, especially, I think, for those of us who were in those sort of situations as children, I think a fair number of us, like, if our parent, now think about this, if your parent is neurodivergent and is unaware, right? Undiagnosed, unaware. They think the way they've experienced the world is the way everyone has experienced the world, right? And they never learn to unmask. They learn that they have to change who they are fundamentally and never show who they are. And they can't let that mask drop for 1 second, even at home, even as a parent, even as a spouse, right? And think about the kind of mental health impact that would have on a person, the exhaustion level, and also the emotional unavailability. Think of the like effectively emotional neglect that would result in, right? And think of the projection of I see the same traits in my child and I really want them to learn early not to do what I did and not to be like I was, because clearly whatever I was wrong. And apparently I produced a wrong, quote unquote child. And now, oh no, I got to fix my kid in order to be a good parent, right? And then you add in the idea that you feel like you can unmask in your house. And I think you have kind of a powder keg there, right? You have a powder keg where you're trying to learn how to be in the world and how to socialize. Your initial models for how to socialize and how to be might look very different in public than they do in your own home. They might treat you very differently in private than they do in public, possibly. Maybe not, but possibly, right? And you might end up with this weird division of like, what is the truth? Like, who is really my mom? Who's really my dad? Who is really this caregiver, this guardian of mine? Which personality of theirs is the right personality, right? How can I ever actually please them? You get into that sort of thing. And you get into that, essentially that sort of cycle of child abuse thing is sort of what I'm getting at, right? It's like the idea that unhealed trauma begets even more trauma. That's what I tend to say. And that's like the hurt people I know, but it's really untreated, right? If they're untreated and unaware and they don't take any accountability for it and they just keep pushing their pain off somebody else or projecting onto other people, you're going to get more toxic behaviors and more of those sort of issues. And so you might end up in this weird complex cycle of like, you adopted some of this, like your parents had all this internalized shame that they then put on you. And now you have all this shame and now you have to mask all the time. And now you don't know really who you are and you can't judge other people's character very well. And then maybe the people you're attracting who are toxic, maybe they do have some sort of diagnosable personality disorder, but maybe they're also an undiagnosed neurodivergent and they were caught in the exact same cycle and they're appealing to you because they seem familiar, right? Like maybe that's what it is. Who knows? Maybe there's a familiarity to it. Or maybe it's because like neurodivergents tend to flock to other neurodivergents. We tend to make friends with other neurodivergents, even if we don't realize it, right? Like in my group, in my circle of friends, it's like people start thinking, maybe I should look into a diagnosis. That sounds similar to me, right? That happens a lot as we get older, Same thing with like queers, queer folk tend to do that too. We tend to flock together more than we think. There's a lot of us who thought we were just really good allies, and then we're like, no, I'm queer, just I'm the more rare flavors. I wonder if that's how much of that actually involves with this as well, right? So, and also involves like how hard it is to unmask and like how much energy we use with all of that. So the truth is, though, I think it's still really important for us to do that individual work, though, for ourselves, regardless of your age and regardless of when you were diagnosed. And honestly, throughout your life, I feel like for myself anyway, at this age, like I've had to recheck in with like, what are my likes? What are my dislikes? Is this thing serving me? How do I feel when I do this thing? Right? Because like my special interests and stuff, right? Or my hyperfixations, like, is it rejuvenating right now or is it exhausting? And if it's exhausting, maybe I need to take a break from it. I mean, for my ADHD side, it's important for that sometimes. And, or like, is this the way my brain actually relaxes? Even if it's a way that like people think I'm nuts for saying that, right? Because one of the ways my brain tends to relax is I love listening to like podcasts and like educational content, essentially, kind of around psychology, if you could tell, while I'm doing like Tetris effects or PictoPix or some sort of visual puzzle thing. Love it. Super relaxing for my brain. But other people look at that and go, how is that relaxing? And I'm like, it is. I don't know. It just is. It's what my brain likes. Right? And so now that I know that about myself, I give myself the time to do that thing, to relax, to kind of take some of the stress off my brain and calm it down a little before bed. So I think that that's also a really important thing for us to know about our own body and get in touch with our body and our regulation and that kind of stuff. Right? And so there's just a lot of work, I guess, that goes into sort of unpacking all of this stuff that I think now that there's a little more awareness growing, and now that there's more late diagnosed neurodivergence, and we're on the internet, now that we have the internet, we can all access other people's experiences and find people with similar experiences and find more, validity, right? We can feel more valid and more real and more, human instead of just a giant mess. I think that, part of that is, where do you even start with unpacking all of this stuff? Because there's a lot. And I don't have a perfect answer because I think everybody goes about it in a different way. But I guess the main take home message is like, what do you need right now? Like, what is that? That's, you know what I mean? Like just thinking about it as yourself, yourself and you. What do you need to feel safe right now? What do you need to rest? What does rest mean to you and your brain and your body? What does recovery mean to your brain and your body? How do you restore your own energy? Is it by doing is it just sleeping? Do you just need a bunch more sleep? Do you need to drink more water? Do you need to eat better? Because we do have that physiological connection there. But also like, do you need to do some like just visual puzzle stuff for fun? Do you need to just watch that same episode of that same show like 10 times because it's so calming to you? Because if that's what you need, that's what you need. Like maybe you don't have the time to watch it 10 times, but you can still watch it at least once, right? Like you can still rewatch it some, or you can jump ahead to your favorite scenes and rewatch those, like it's okay. It's okay to seek comfort in those sort of things, And it's a good place to start, just instead of judging yourself of that, being like, oh, I'm such a weirdo for watching the same thing. Like I've seen this movie 300 times and here I am, I'm going to rewatch it again. Who cares? Rewatch it if you want to. Whatever. Life is short. Enjoy it. I watched, when I was in middle school, the animated Beauty and the Beast came out, the Disney animated Beauty and the Beast, and we got a VHS of that thing. Because, it was like early 90s, Speaking of the ancient magics of pre-DVDs, we had VHSs, right? And I watched that movie. Now, granted, it's only 90 minutes. It's a very short movie compared to the live action, which was not as good as the animated movie at all. pacing was all kinds of off. Anyway, I rewatched that thing every day after school. I want to say for almost 2 years. And I remember my older sister like complained about that. I only have one sister, but she's older than me. And she was just like, "You're going to watch it again?" And I'm like, "Yeah." Because it was my comfort. It was my go-to. It was my relaxation after school. And my parents weren't home yet from work. So it's like, might as well watch it. You know, it helps me to relax after school and before the evening hits, you know? And so, yeah, do the things you want to do. As long as they're not harming other people, do the things that you need to do to help relax and get to a slightly bigger sense of like peace. And then you can get in touch with that. The more you do it, the faster it is for you to access. And the more you access it, the more you start to learn like who you are when you feel at peace with yourself and will you feel happy being yourself. And that's where you can start to learn to unmask in bits and pieces, right? Also, total side note, anyone out there who's telling a neurodivergent, like if there's a mental health person or somebody you know who's like, you should never mask, that person's full of crap. Just want to say. So just like this Redditor was saying, they would be abused and punished or worse for unmasking in public, right? If you're not safe to unmask, don't unmask. Trust that instinct, okay? If you're scared to do it, that's different than feeling unsafe. If you have close friends and you're a little scared to unmask around them, you know, can't guarantee they're going to handle it well, but it would be good to know if they can tolerate it or not, right? But if you're wherever you live, your society, your town, your family, if it's unsafe for you to mask around them, don't do it. Don't do it. You got to maintain your safety, right? And this also gets at like intersectionalities when it comes to certain communities and cultures and races and ethnicities and all of that sort of stuff, right? Unmasking can mean something very different depending who you're around, what the culture is of where you're around, and what the social expectations of you are, and what the consequences of breaking those expectations are, right? That also needs to be balanced with that. So my advice for that would be if you have some sort of professional recommending you to completely unmask, no. That's like telling a transgender person to come out to literally everybody all at once. No. Or a gay person in an incredibly homophobic society to come out as gay. No. That is not safe. That is not a safe thing to say to somebody, right? That is something they got to do in their own time. And same thing with unmasking. So that's my other little soapbox about that. All right. I think I've said plenty of things. I just talk forever. So I only got through 2, but they sort of connected, sort of. A little bit of a theme, right? I hope some of what I said helped. Maybe it helped with some of the perspective. If I said something that surprised you, maybe put in a comment below. If you feel like I missed something, put it in a comment below. And what do you think in terms of like, am I reaching here? Do you see that there's a connection between like masking and fawn responsing and like not being able to tell toxic people? Or is there something about our family lives sometimes for some of us that like lead more toward, and I'm not saying to victim blame or anything, because toxic people are going to be toxic, right? Like honestly, there are some very well put together people who still get sucked in by these personality types. So like, it's not just neurodivergence, and it's not something wrong with you if you get sucked into toxic people, because right now our world is kind of rewarding them a bit, you know, for some of that attitude. All right. Anyway, drop some comments below. If you have more either Reddit comments or you see videos on TikTok or Instagram or YouTube or somewhere that you want me to respond to, click on over to my Google form and drop a submission there and just include a link to the thing. And I would love to do that a little more. I know sometimes it helps me to understand sort of how to apply a person's viewpoint or theory of something through hearing them sort of think through and talk through things like that. So if this helps you out, I'm so grateful, and stick a comment below that it helped you, and send me more topic submissions for what you want me to hear me kind of think through. That can include speech language stuff. It doesn't have to be neurodivergent stuff, but I'm happy to do that because that is one of my things, but that's one of my areas I like a lot. But you know, if you have something about articulation or disfluency, speech disfluency, like stuttering or something, you can also drop something there as well. All right. With all that said, let's use our weirdness powers for good to create a safer, more unmasked community with each other, and perhaps help to discharge some of that shame we keep inheriting from society. And in that sense, I wish for you all to keep it weird. And until next time, guys. Bye.